Millionaire woman marries her chauffeur in secret. The media finds out and the truth explodes. Victoria Sterling had built her empire from nothing. At 35, she commanded a tech conglomerate worth $3 billion from her Manhattan penthouse office, her steely blue eyes reflecting the ambition that had driven her since her father's dismissive words 20 years ago. Business isn't for women, Victoria. Find yourself a good husband instead. Those words had forged her into the iron-willed CEO who now sat in boardrooms where men twice her age hung on her every decision. Her blonde hair was always perfectly coiffed, her designer suits impeccable, her reputation untouchable. The media called her the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley, and she wore the title like armor, but armor has cracks. And Victoria's began to show 3 years ago when she hired Michael Thompson as her personal chauffeur. Michael wasn't what anyone expected. At 32, he possessed an understated handsomeness that contrasted sharply with the polished executives in Victoria's orbit. His dark hair was always neat but never styled. His clothes clean but never expensive. He drove her black Bentley with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. A former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning to a country that seemed to have forgotten men like him, while Victoria's world was filled with calculated conversations and strategic smiles. Michael offered something she'd forgotten existed: genuine kindness without agenda. He remembered she preferred her coffee black during morning meetings, noticed when she'd skipped lunch during hostile takeovers, and never once asked her for anything beyond his modest salary. The transformation happened gradually, like seasons changing. Victoria began looking forward to their morning drives, when Michael would share stories about his childhood in rural Ohio, his voice carrying the warmth of wheat fields and summer evenings. She found herself staying late at the office, not for work, but for the quiet ride home when the city lights blurred past and Michael's presence provided a sanctuary from the relentless pressure of her empire. Their first real conversation happened during a snowstorm that stranded them at the office overnight. Victoria discovered that Michael had been secretly taking night classes in business administration, driven by dreams of one day opening a small auto repair shop in his hometown. She saw in his eyes the same hunger she'd once felt, but tempered with a humility her world had beaten out of her long ago. The night they first kissed, Victoria was crying in the back of the Bentley after a particularly brutal board meeting where her own vice president had attempted a coup. Michael had pulled over, turned to face her, and for the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling allowed herself to be vulnerable. His hands were rough from years of honest work, but his touch was gentle as he wiped away her tears. Their relationship became Victoria's most carefully guarded secret. She'd built her reputation on being untouchable, uncompromising, alone at the top. The media loved speculating about her love life, linking her to senators, celebrities, and fellow billionaires. None of them knew about the quiet evenings in Michael's modest Brooklyn apartment, where Victoria would sit on his second-hand couch, her head on his shoulder, finally able to breathe. The decision to marry came after Victoria's mother suffered a heart attack. As Victoria sat in the hospital waiting room, terrified and alone, Michael appeared despite not being called. He'd heard about the emergency through the office grapevine and had driven straight there, not as her employee, but as the man who loved her. That night, Victoria realized she was tired of hiding the only real happiness she'd ever known. They married on a Tuesday morning at City Hall, with only 2 witnesses they'd found in the hallway. Victoria wore a simple navy dress she'd bought the day before, and Michael wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to his father's funeral. No cameras, no reporters, no family members who would demand explanations. Just a judge, 2 ordinary people, and vows that meant everything because they meant nothing to anyone else. For 6 months, Victoria lived a double life. By day, she was the ruthless CEO who just acquired her 15th company. By night, she was Mrs. Thompson, learning to cook pasta in Michael's tiny kitchen while he told her stories about his deployment that he'd never shared with anyone else. She discovered that happiness wasn't about conquering the world. It was about finding someone who loved her not despite her flaws, but because of them. The secret felt sustainable until Victoria's assistant, Jennifer, began noticing changes. Victoria smiled more, left the office earlier, and seemed less interested in the social events that had once been crucial for networking. When Jennifer mentioned casually that Victoria seemed happier lately, Victoria's carefully constructed facade nearly cracked. The first real threat came from Harrison Sterling, Victoria's younger brother and the company's coup. He'd always resented Victoria's success, believing their father's fortune should have been his birthright. During a family dinner at their mother's estate in the Hamptons, Harrison cornered Victoria about her recent behavior. His suspicions were sharp and pointed. Victoria had been spotted in Brooklyn, of all places. She'd been seen at a small Italian restaurant, laughing with a man who definitely wasn't from their social circle. Victoria deflected with practiced ease, but Harrison's eyes held a dangerous glint that reminded her too much of their father. The weight of this secret began affecting Victoria's work. She found herself distracted during crucial meetings, her mind wandering to Michael and the life they were building in stolen moments. Her legendary focus began to slip, and the business world noticed. Stock prices fluctuated with every rumor about Victoria's personal life, and competitors began circling like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Michael, meanwhile, struggled with his own demons. He'd grown up in a world where men were measured by their ability to provide, yet he was dependent on his wife's wealth in ways that challenged everything he'd been taught about masculinity. The few friends he'd confided in had reacted with everything from disbelief to accusations of being a gold digger. The isolation was crushing, but his love for Victoria kept him grounded. The chapter ended with Victoria receiving an anonymous note in her office. "I know about the marriage. We should talk." The note was typed, untraceable, and terrifying in its simplicity. Victoria's hands trembled as she read it, the carefully constructed walls of her secret life beginning to crumble around her. The anonymous note was just the beginning. Within 48 hours, Victoria Sterling's world imploded with the precision of a controlled demolition. The first story broke on TMZ at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday. The headline screamed across social media: "Billionaire Ice Queen's secret marriage to her driver." The accompanying photos showed Victoria and Michael leaving City Hall 6 months earlier, their faces clearly visible as they walked hand in hand. Someone had been watching, waiting, documenting their most private moment. Victoria's phone exploded with calls from reporters, board members, and family. Her mother, Margaret Sterling, arrived at the penthouse within the hour, her face a mask of aristocratic fury. The woman who'd raised Victoria to believe that image was everything stood in the marble foyer, her voice sharp as crystal as she demanded explanations for this catastrophic lapse in judgment. The media-feeding frenzy was unlike anything Victoria had experienced. Every major news outlet picked up the story, each adding their own angle. Business channels questioned her decision-making capabilities. Gossip magazines dug into Michael's background, painting him as everything from a fortune hunter to a war hero, depending on their narrative needs. Social media exploded with opinions, memes, and think pieces about class, power, and love. The most damaging story came from Harrison. Victoria's own brother had been the anonymous note sender, and he'd been gathering evidence for months. His jealousy had transformed into a calculated campaign to destroy Victoria's reputation and, by extension, her control of the company. He'd hired private investigators, bribed sources, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Harrison's masterstroke was a prime-time interview where he painted Victoria as mentally unstable, suggesting that her secret marriage was evidence of a breakdown that made her unfit to lead a public company. He positioned himself as the concerned brother trying to save the family business from his sister's erratic behavior. The performance was Oscar-worthy and devastating. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Victoria sat at the head of the mahogany table where she'd commanded respect for over a decade. But now the faces around her showed doubt, calculation, and barely concealed excitement at her potential downfall. Stock prices plummeted as investors questioned whether a CEO who'd hidden such a significant personal decision could be trusted with their money. Michael found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never wanted. Reporters camped outside his Brooklyn apartment, his modest background dissected by strangers who'd never worked an honest day in their lives. Former military colleagues were interviewed, neighbors were quoted, and his deceased father's financial struggles were used as evidence of his alleged gold-digging motives. The worst part was the isolation. Victoria's social circle abandoned her with the efficiency of a military retreat. Charity galas were suddenly full, lunch invitations mysteriously disappeared, and former friends crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. The woman who'd once been the most powerful person in any room found herself utterly alone. Except for Michael, but Michael was fighting his own battles. The media attention had cost him his privacy, his dignity, and ultimately his job. Victoria had been forced to fire him to avoid further scandal, a decision that tore at both their hearts but seemed necessary for damage control. He watched from his apartment as his wife's empire crumbled, powerless to help the woman he'd married for love. The turning point came during a hostile takeover attempt. Victoria's competitors, sensing weakness, launched a coordinated attack on her company's stock. Harrison supported the takeover, believing he could negotiate a better position with the new owners. As Victoria sat in her office, watching her life's work slip away, she realized she'd been fighting the wrong battle. Instead of hiding their love, Victoria decided to fight for it. She called a press conference, her first public appearance since the scandal broke. The room was packed with reporters expecting to see a broken woman announcing her resignation. Instead, they saw Victoria Sterling at her most powerful, not despite her vulnerability, but because of it. Victoria's speech was a masterclass in authenticity. She spoke about the loneliness of power, the impossibility of finding genuine love when everyone wanted something from you, and the courage Michael had shown by loving her not for her wealth, but for who she was beneath the designer suits and corporate armor. She admitted to keeping their marriage secret, not out of shame, but out of fear that the world would destroy something beautiful simply because it didn't fit their expectations. The speech went viral within hours. The narrative began to shift as people saw past the scandal to the love story underneath. Victoria's vulnerability, so carefully hidden for years, became her greatest strength. Women around the world shared their own stories of choosing love over expectation, of finding happiness in unexpected places. Michael, watching from his apartment, felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with his wife's wealth and everything to do with her courage. He'd fallen in love with Victoria's strength, but he'd married her for her heart, the heart she was now showing to the world. The board meeting that followed was Victoria's Waterloo, but she faced it like a general who'd chosen her battlefield. She presented a choice: accept her marriage and her leadership, or find a new CEO. Some board members, particularly the older ones, couldn't reconcile their traditional views with Victoria's choices. But others, especially the younger generation, saw in Victoria's authenticity a leadership style that resonated with changing times. The vote was close, closer than Victoria had hoped, but decisive enough to keep her position. She'd retained control of her company, but more importantly, she'd retained her integrity. The cost was high. Several board members resigned, some investors pulled out, and the stock price remained volatile. But Victoria had learned that success without authenticity was just an elaborate prison. The story's resolution came 6 months later. Victoria and Michael remarried. This time in a ceremony that was both public and private, a small gathering of friends and family who'd stood by. Them, with the media invited to witness but not intrude. Victoria wore her grandmother's wedding dress, and Michael wore a suit he'd bought with his own money, saved from his new job running a Veterans Assistance Program, funded by Victoria's foundation, that the Sterling Corporation recovered stronger than before. Victoria's authentic leadership style attracted new investors who valued transparency and genuine values over traditional corporate performance. The company's stock reached new highs, but Victoria measured success differently now by the balance between professional achievement and personal happiness. Michael found his own path to success. Using his military background and business education, he created a non-profit organization helping veterans transition to civilian careers. Victoria supported the venture, but Michael led it, finally finding a way to contribute that matched his values and skills. He was no longer just Victoria Sterling's husband. He was Michael Thompson, making his own mark on the world. The final scene showed them 5 years later, sitting on the porch of a house in the Hamptons, not the family estate, but a modest home they'd bought together. Victoria had learned to garden, her hands now comfortable with soil as well as spreadsheets. Michael had found peace in a life that balanced service to others with love for his wife. The media had moved on to other scandals, but Victoria and Michael had found something more valuable than headlines, a love that had survived the explosion of truth and emerged stronger for being tested. They'd learned that the greatest victory wasn't defeating the world's expectations, but having the courage to live authentically despite them. Their story became legend in business schools and romance novels alike, proof that love could survive in the most challenging circumstances, that authenticity was the greatest form of power, and that sometimes the greatest risk was also the greatest reward. Victoria Sterling had conquered the business world, but her greatest achievement was learning to be vulnerable with the man who'd loved her when she was just Victoria. Not the ice queen, not the billionaire, but simply a woman who'd found her way home.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.